Hello, everybody, and welcome back. For this is part 2 of the 4 Buddhist paths to happiness and well-being. It's sponsored by the Chenrezig Tibetan Buddhist Center in Philadelphia. And I'm Jeffrey Carr. I'm a long-term Sangha member and teacher at the Tibetan Buddhist Center in Philadelphia. And I'm delighted to be offering these online classes that we hope will be the first in a series of online teachings for the Chenrezig Buddhist Center. One of its missions is the preservations of the original teachings and something of the Tibetan cultural context for these teachings. What I'm going to be trying to do today, the classes, is to provide a map, an outline, an overview, almost a schematic for all of you who might be just starting meditation or thinking about meditation and maybe visiting for the first or second time the Tibetan Buddhist Center in Philadelphia. And you've kind of heard the terminology and you've heard a little bit about this and that, and you've begun to form a mental picture of how this fits together. But some of the terms are very obtuse. Some of them are very foreign looking, like, for example, those big tunkas, those images of green Tara that you might see at the center. What are those all about? And who or what was the Buddha? Is the Buddha an abstracted idea about enlightenment? Is it a historic teacher? Is it some kind of a deity? You know, what are all these figures and these images we're looking at? And what all is that terminology that we encounter in those beautiful sutra books? What is all that about? So I want to provide sort of an overview, an intellectual framework for it. And it's up to you to fill in all the blanks and to, as you encounter further teachings or have different kinds of experiences with Buddhism, both at the Tibetan Buddhist Center or at other meditation centers, you begin to understand, oh, this fits into this schema. I've made an effort to provide the PowerPoint set of notes for the first lecture to everybody who's registered in the classes. And my daughter and I are in the last stages of having it put up, the actual lectures put up on YouTube videos. And we had a glitch at the last minute with the getting access to it, but very shortly we'll have posted the original recording for the first talk and the recording for this talk. Right in front of you are the course dates for the upcoming classes. This is going to be class 2, the Great Path of Awakening. It deals with a very large school of Buddhism, the dominant school of Buddhism, called the Mahayana. And then next week, we're going to be talking about the Diamond Path of Realization, which is called the Vajrayana, and that's the heart of the Tibetan Buddhist path. And finally, the path of the Great Perfection, which is Dzogchen, Hatha Yoga, and Mahamudra, which are considered the culmination of the spiritual path, according to the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, and in fact to all Buddhist teachings. So a traditional way they present the teaching style in Buddhism, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, is in terms of goal, path, and results. And here's what I hope to accomplish with these courses. Again, as I told you, I want this class not to provide a detailed investigation into parts of the philosophy, but sort of an outline version of all of it, of the 4 principal paths in Buddhist teaching. What I'm going to be doing is doing most of the talking. We're not really going to have time for much meditation, but I will teach you a spiritual practice or 2 characteristic of each one of these 4 approaches. And it is to provide sort of like intellectual overview. That way, when you do it or are taught these practices in your courses, surrounded by your fellow meditators or your fellow spiritual practitioners, you'll understand what it's about. For example, when you chant the Heart Sutra as part of your morning sadhana at the center, you'll understand, oh my gosh, now I kind of understand why we're doing that and where that's coming from. Okay, what I'd like to have for the results for you is you have a basic understanding, an overview of what Buddhism is, but more important, what it isn't. Because it is a particular spiritual path, and it's quite distinct from some of the other great spiritual traditions of the world. And I want it to be able to really guide you in your own spiritual and meditation practice, which if you've been doing it for 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, we all know changes constantly our spiritual practices and requires as much effort as we're willing to put into it. The more effort and time we give to it, the more we'll get out of it. This is, again, the class 2, the Great Path of Awakening. And I'd like you, if you were around for the last week's class, you might remember that I started out with the image of a wheel. The wheel was the first image that sort of symbolized Buddhism. The other image I showed you was a pair of the Buddhist footprints. The wheel represented the wheel of Dharma, and it represented the 8 noble truths of Buddhism, which is the very centerpiece of the Buddha's original teachings. I want you, if you can, mentally to contrast that with this current image in front of you now, which is this gorgeous, very elaborate, over the top, gilded Buddha image, very different from the image of the original Buddhist teachings of the wheel or the sort of the gaunt Buddha meditating under a tree. This is the world of the Mahayana, which is the great dispensation. It was when Buddhism was tried to make attractive and accessible for all kinds of people, not just for a renunciate group of monks. So as I mentioned, Buddhism has 4 principal vehicles, and we're going to do a very quick review of what we went over last week. So the 4 vehicles are called the Hinayana, the Mahayana, the Vajrayana, and Dzogchen. Each one of those great bodies of teachings share a set of core teachings of the Buddha, and I'm going to be addressing those today. Each one of them developed historically in response to individual and societal needs in ancient India, and increasingly there was a Buddhism left India. In fact, it almost died out in India. It was because of the Muslim invasions in what we would call the medieval period, about 1200 to 1400, I think it was a common era. There was a diaspora. The Buddhist teaching spread throughout Southeast Asia, into Tibet, into China, Japan, and into Southeast Asia, and some extent into Persia and the Middle East, but not much. Each time it spread into a new country, a new culture, it adopted a slightly different look, slightly different set of practices, and it addressed slightly different needs based on what those cultural needs were, where it spread. But each one of these paths was addressing a central preoccupation for the human beings, for the human condition. And that is the fact that all of us are born, we suffer, and then inevitably we die. And this is all through history. We as human beings, we have so much more elaborate awareness than many, many forms of other life. So we're aware of the fact that we're going to have, that we're frightened about the future, that we regret things in the past. And we're aware that inevitably we're going to die. And religion and spirituality has always attempted to address those deep, fundamental anxieties about the human condition. Buddhism is such a gigantic spiritual tradition that there's going to be something in each one of these 4 principal paths that will appeal to everyone. In fact, some of the aspects of Buddhism, the more sort of what I would call culturally religious or iconographical or ritual side, I just won't have time to go into. But there's just a vast range of practices within Buddhism, and it is consciously designed to make it appealing to all kinds of temperaments, all kinds of cultural backgrounds, all kinds of needs that people have. So the first of these 4 principal paths is called the Hinayana. And that is a term actually that the Mahayana, the great path, people tend to use for these original set of teachings from the Buddha. It means the little vehicle. And it's called the little vehicle. The Mahayana means great vehicle. It's called the little vehicle or the little path because the goal is individual salvation. The Hinayana is the one that we spoke about last week. It's based on the original teachings of the Buddha, which is called the Tipitaka, or it's called Pali Canon. It's called the Pali Canon because Pali was the original language that many centuries after the historic Buddha's death, the teachings were finally written down in the language of Pali, and they were written down on leaves. It took it that long because it was an oral culture, as was all of the great traditions in this. This is what? This was almost 800 years before what we call the Common Era, is when Buddha was teaching. And it was, for many centuries, it was passed down almost verbatim from generation to generation of monastics, and only got written down fairly late in its evolution. The Hinayana is often identified with Theravadan Buddhism, which is an extant, it's a still existent form of Buddhism. It means the teaching of the elders. It's very much the basis for whenever you see an insight meditation society, or you talk about mindfulness qualities, which is a big topic in contemporary Buddhism. We're talking about the concepts, the practices, and the insights of the original Buddhist teachings. And there are many wonderful contemporary teachers and Western-trained teachers who put it into a Western vernacular, but it's still the original Buddhist teachings. It's based originally on a monastic ideal of renunciation, and renunciation of ordinary worldly desires. It's based on the cultivation of virtue and good behavior and a high degree of ethics, and also on the deliberate elimination and overcoming of negative mind states. What's that considered in the Hinayana? Hatred, aversion, dislike of things, a desire, anger, greed, all what we would consider also painful and negative mind states. And what would they consider virtue? I think in a moment I'm going to show you a quick list of what the virtues are from the Hinayana, and I doubt you would have any problems for it. What the goal of the Hinayana is to foster positive, loving mind states, but by doing it by training and purifying the mind. Last week I made the point that Buddhism, as far as I know, is unique among world religions and spiritual philosophies, is there is no notion of a God that is out there, or fate, or something which is determining the experience of human beings. Human beings ultimately control their own fates, and it's ultimately up to you or up to us individually to purify ourselves of our own suffering, which is brought upon by ourselves, by our negative conditioning, our negative habits of mind, and our own sense of individual needs, aggressions, issues. It's, as I said, we reviewed that extensively last week. The Hinayana path is all about overcoming the causes of suffering. As I said it last week, the Buddha referred to himself as the great physician. He sort of told his first generation of disciples, he said, all I am about is about identifying the causes of your suffering and offering you a solution for suffering. He said, that's my only interest. They asked him, are you a god? Are you a deity? He said, no. They said, what about God? What about final things? He said, I'm not going to address those. All I would do if I were to issue an opinion about divinities would be to cause all of you to start arguing among yourselves as to what's right, what's wrong. That's not what I want to do here. What I want to do is eliminate what's making you unhappy. And briefly, these are the craving and our attachment to sense pleasures, emotion, thoughts, and false beliefs, ignorance of the nature of mind and of reality, our emotional hang-ups, that old-fashioned term, or problems. The term in Buddhism is called the kleshas. And finally, our habits of mind that might make us unhappy. For example, worry, doubt, repetitive anger at certain things. Those cause us to be upset and turns us to act out towards others. And we often feel we're helpless. We're a victim of our habits. The Buddha said, no, these things can be overcome. The craving and attachment to sense pleasures are the kinds of things where we have almost an irrational, unpleasant, and disruptive need for things like addictions to certain states of mind, addictions to certain needs we have. So the Buddha said the prescription, the way to solve these aspects of suffering is what he said, basically the Four Noble Truths. This was his doctor's prescription. He said that fundamentally existence, the problem why we're unhappy is fundamentally existence is difficult. It's unsatisfying. It's what the term is dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, but I think a better translation people have offered is unsatisfactoriness, limitedness. It's quality of being not really what we needed. And dukkha would include all those things we're constantly striving for and constantly trying to avoid because we both need them and we're afraid not to have them. He says, what causes this kind of suffering? And he says it's basically this craving that I talked about. It's called tanha. That's the technical term. He said, so what do we do about this kind of craving? He said, well, there is a solution for it. You're not stuck with it eternally. There's such a thing called the cessation of suffering, and it's called nirvana. And it is actually a state where you completely overcome, for example, your fear of death, your fear of being without money, your terrible need to have people think well of you, your addictions to all kinds of things. I'll talk about it a little bit later, about the 8 worldly winds, the things that are our core addictions that make us unhappy as human beings. The Buddha said we can do something about it. We can overcome it. And the prescription, he said, will lead you eventually to a state called nirvana, which is where the extinction of our wounding, our sense of need and suffering. The Hinayana principle teachings also include one of the core reasons why we suffer is impermanence. And I think I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more later on. It is an enormous subject, and in certain ways, it's what the Hinayana is all about. It's really getting into the state of impermanence. If you can come to grips with it, if you can make your peace with impermanence, most of your troubles will be over with. And finally, as I discussed, is nirvana, the ultimate goal in the Hinayana path, which is the extinction of personal dukkha or suffering. The Noble Eightfold Path is his prescription for how do you go about achieving nirvana or the extinction of personal suffering. And they are eight, as I said, there are 8 sets of teachings, and they are grouped around 3 principal subjects. The first one is the pursuit of a high level of ethics. And briefly, we went over it extensively last week. You can see it in the notes, is right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And I don't think I go into much more depth about these. I did quite a bit last week. But briefly, the old saying, what goes around comes around. If you speak ill of other people, eventually people will start speaking badly about you. If you hurt other people, it makes it much more likely that people are going to hurt you. And finally, livelihood, what you do for a living. If you do something for a living that is harming other beings, that's not so good. Eventually, that will come back to haunt you. You'll be in an environment where eventually beings will be harming you. Another group of the teachings is mental discipline, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And finally, there's a group of teachings around wisdom, leading to nirvana, right thought and right understanding. I think I go into those. I think, well, you can look at them from last week, or they will be covered in one way or another today. Other goals of the Hinayana, the goals actually of the Eightfold Path. You should come out of it, a result of it, short-term and long-term, is vastly increased metta or loving kindness. That includes being kinder to yourself. You know, one of the people that we treat worst is ourselves, constantly, criticizing ourselves, running ourselves down, doubting ourselves. So metta or loving kindness means kindness towards others and kindness toward oneself. Another goal is mental concentration, so that all of those random thoughts and the inability to control your attention gets calmed down. You can accomplish this through the meditation techniques. You get a calm, mindful, and a joyous state of mind. How do you do it? I spoke last week quite a bit about 2 fundamental mindfulness-based meditation practices, shamatha and vipassana meditation. And this is people who go on, let's say, insight meditation retreats where they really practice shamatha and vipassana. I remember a person at TBC Sangha who went for a week retreat and he couldn't believe it. He had suffered from anxiety all his life, and he came back and he said it was a miracle. He had tried everything, and this had actually done a tremendous amount to alleviate this terrible anxiety he had felt all his life. That's not quite the same, but it's in the direction of achievement of nirvana, or peace, which is the extinction of personal suffering, and that's the ultimate goal. Later on, I'll talk about the differences and similarities between nirvana and a related goal called enlightenment. But in any case, nirvana, one who has achieved nirvana is called an arhat in this Hinayana, in the original Buddhist teachings. And on the side there, you see a Chinese depiction of an arhat, one of these. And I like to think that this is someone, sort of the original followers of the Buddha, how they might appear. And I want you to remember it because there'll be a very different look to the Mahayana. It'll be a very different. How do we go about taming this thing called the mind? It's fundamental to Buddhism to say that everything proceeds from mind. Certainly all of our happiness and all of our unhappiness is a result of the mind. I want to take note because in our culture, it's one of the things that we tell ourselves is that somehow we're subject to our DNA and we can't control our unhappiness, or we're subject to fate or some deities trying to do it to us. That's sort of not the Buddhist philosophy. The Buddhist philosophy is ultimately we do control it ourselves. And the way we get control over our minds, which, as I mentioned a few slides ago, we have our thoughts and our sense of attention. We can't really control our thought processes very well. We're constantly dwelling, going off the point, or we're worrying, or we're dealing with thoughts we don't particularly want to deal with. We have emotions that are out of control. We're either depressed or we get angry. We feel that we're the victims of our emotions. And finally, we have false views of reality. And what does that mean? Well, among thing is we believe things that just aren't true. For example, I'm a terrible person. Is that really true? You may have done terrible things, but does that make you a terrible person? Many people believe that, though. How do we overcome false beliefs about the nature of reality and the nature of our experience? So we do that through this process of, in this Hinayana tradition, of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The first one is just to get control of the mind. Anybody who's tried to sit down and meditate for a few minutes has realized that your mind is completely out of control. You can't seem to keep on a subject for more than a few seconds before your mind is off daydreaming or worried or you spaced out or something. So we first, the Buddha taught this practice, is the first practice in teaching meditation is mindfulness. And the way you learn mindfulness is to concentrate on your breath. So this is essential to shamatha meditation. The breath is, as once was taught to me, it's always there. You're never without your breath, unless you're dead. As long as you're alive, you've got your breath. And you train the mind by gently focusing on the breath. And I taught shamatha-based meditation in an abstract way last week. And you should, if you aren't already practicing shamatha meditation, get somebody to show you how to do it. But the other 3 stages of the foundations of mindfulness is, I wrote the word contemplation because you don't strictly need to do contemplations of sensations and feelings of the body in a meditation posture. Buddha taught you were supposed to adopt that strict meditation posture when you did shamatha, breath awareness. But for contemplation of the sensations and feelings of the body is learning how to suddenly take your preoccupation with being lost in your thoughts and bring yourself embodied, bring yourself into this sense organ that we call the body. That means paying very careful attention to very subtle mood states. Like right now, I'm going to draw my attention, and I'm drawing my attention to the small of my back. And I'm feeling right now the vertebrae right between my shoulder blades, and that area right between my shoulder blades right now. And I'm going to actually consciously drop my shoulders and relax that area of my back. I'm also right now drawing my attention into right about the solar plexus area of my body. In any case, I've done quite a bit of this. It has a miraculous ability to calm and make you much more sensitive to what's going on with your body. It will actually make your life a lot better. And finally, when you're feeling a lot of anxiety, as you get control of your feelings and sensations of your body, you will find by paying attention to that, you can do a lot to control your anxiety. The next contemplation, and these are taught very systematically in this 4 foundations of mindfulness, is to become very aware of all of those very subtle mind states. They're called mind formations, mental formations. Everything going through your mind, feeling slightly ill at ease, feeling excited, feeling preoccupied, feeling anxious, feeling excited, feeling great pleasure. What are those about? It's a universe of very subtle, not strictly the emotions like anger or extreme joy, not necessarily like that, often the very, very subtle things. Faint feelings of dis-ease, some sense that somebody's watching us, or some feeling of expansiveness where we feel a great deal of space around us. All of these things are mind states. And you spend a long time getting very acquainted with the universe that you are. What's going on with you in these very subtle perceptual states that normally people are so lost in their thoughts, their hopes, and their anxieties, they don't pay attention to what they're actually experiencing. Finally, the contemplation of dharmas. Dharma means a structure, a way a thing works, the composition of a thing, the teaching of a thing, teaching the sense of an explanation of something. Dharmas can refer to spiritual teachings, but they also refer to like the dharma of a society or the dharma of your relationship, the truth of it. So this includes looking carefully and becoming very observant of all those thoughts, beliefs, conceptions, imaginations, visualizations, all of our mental, intellectual, conceptual stuff that are constantly flooding our heads. And I'm going to tell you in advance, it can be a revelation to find out that you are paying attention to beliefs and ideas which you had no idea that you were actually privy to. I'm going to give you a little advance hint. Whatever you find that makes you angry or irritable or like, wait a minute, you heard or someone said something or you read something or you saw something on TV that hit one of these beliefs, these convictions. And all this is asking is not right or wrong, but just become aware of what you actually think is true and what you actually think is false. Become aware of that, because that is influencing your sense of reality and your sense of happiness far more than you're aware of. So that in a nutshell is the Hinayana path. For those who are attracted to the insight meditation techniques, for these original moral teachings of the Buddha, hallelujah, great, good for you. They can become a whole life study. Okay, you can actually go the whole distance towards solving everything just through the Hinayana path. In the tradition, especially as the Mahayana teaches it, you've got to handle your own issues first. As you begin to get a little grip on the Eightfold Path, as you begin to get a little grip on the 4 foundations of mindfulness and begin to be able to handle your own mental processes a little bit more successfully, almost you begin to naturally open up to another set of ideals. And this is the great Mahayana. Pious Buddhists, ones who are, love Buddhism and want to think that the Buddha did everything, say that the Buddha made 4 great turnings of the wheel of Dharma, taught 4 great turnings of the wheel of Dharma, and taught them successively, and made it was a little bit more complex with each one of his restatements of the fundamental truths of Buddhism. He put in a little bit more into each one of the teachings. Other people say, actually, well, maybe they developed historically. So I'm going to adopt forgive me, but the historic model. And I said, forgive me to the Buddhist who would like to say that the Buddha is the one who came up with all this. Maybe he or whatever it was, maybe it did, I don't know. But I do know that the Mahayana evolved many centuries after the original Buddha died in, oh my God, I should have my notes here. I think I said 800 before. I think it's 650. I'm not sure what date is the supposed death of the historic Buddha. But centuries later in India, his order of monks and his orders of nuns gradually began to consolidate the teachings. They recorded all of the verbal teachings called sutras, all of his original sutras, and then they began to write commentaries on the sutras, a little like any religious tradition. And this grew into an enormous, they call them universities, but they were gigantic monastic centers. And Buddhism was enormously successful in India and actually predates a lot of the later Indian philosophies like the Bhagavad Gita. It predates the Bhagavad Gita and influenced the development of Indian philosophy as Indian philosophy began to influence Buddhism. This happened in this what I call the medieval period of Buddhist philosophy. Again, it was about 1,000 years ago. Buddhism, as it spread through Southeast Asia, especially after the diaspora period like that, it began to evolve because people had different needs. One thing it began to address is the needs of people who were not monks and nuns. Do you remember Buddha was primarily teaching to monks and nuns? The people who weren't monks and nuns, who were just interested Buddhists, they were expected to contribute and listen to the monks and nuns, but the monks and nuns were doing most of the hard work. Okay, as Mahayana developed, they tried to find forms of Buddhism that served ordinary needs of people. People who just wanted to make more money. They've got somebody sick in the family. What do we do about our funeral services? Would you bless my children? All of these ordinary human needs. And that's what the Mahayana began to offer. And it also began to develop, as it encountered different cultures, many different kinds of varieties and what I'll call religions based in Buddhism. The Mahayana includes very different forms of Buddhism, like Zen Buddhism. And you all have your image of an austere, maybe Japanese Zen monk. There was a similar philosophy of Buddhism in China called Chan. There is, the Tibetan Buddhism is actually what we call a tantric kind of Buddhism. And Tantra, I won't go into it now, but is borrowed from Indian philosophy. It's actually where Tantra came from. And finally, there are many kinds of what I'm calling devotional, religious forms of Buddhism. The original Buddha, he just said, listen, I'm a human being. I know I'm much more aware than you are, but I'm a human being. But as Buddhism evolved, it could become more devotional. So, or what I'm calling religious. So my wife Laura and I watched briefly last night a little program on Bangkok. And they had a Theravadan, it was a traditional Theravadan Buddhist temple, covered with gold leaf, monks and nuns, but doing this elaborate initiation of a family member, because in that tradition, most male members, I don't know if it's all, but most male members were expected to spend weeks or months as a monk, and they were initiated into it. And it was a big thing for the family, and it was a big honor and all that. It was serving many other needs other than this original search for nirvana. And of course, in many temples all over the world, you'll find people burning incense sticks to ancestors and doing that kind of thing in Buddhist temples. So they evolved to serve many people's needs. The Mahayana expanded this original goal of nirvana, which is the complete cessation, the complete extinction of personal suffering, into a much bigger ideal of Buddhahood or enlightenment. Buddhahood and enlightenment are really talked about much more in the Mahayana. The Mahayana also developed something called a bodhisattva ideal, which is an ideal of salvation for all sentient beings throughout all space. And the Buddhist idea of conscious beings, or beings, I'll define a sentient being as any kind of a life form that can experience pleasure and pain. I'm going to call that sentience. Some people define sentient beings a little bit more exclusively as a being that's capable of being aware of itself, on our planet, as far as we know, I think chimps, dolphins, and maybe some other animals are capable of being aware of themselves. Okay, so some people say that's sentience. I like the idea of anything that's sentient is capable of sense of self, in the sense that they can experience pleasure and pain. So the Bodhisattva ideal is to want to deliver all of those beings from personal suffering. You have to understand that Buddhists take reincarnation, successive lives. Most of them take it for granted. Okay, so this might take place over many, many, many successive lives. Bodhicitta is an ideal, or bodhicitta means, bodhi means an enlightened awareness. Buddha means discriminating awareness. I realized last week in the lecture I called it consciousness. That was not right. Buddhi means actually discriminating awareness, or kind of what we might call intelligence. So the bodhi is like an enlightened intelligence, and citta is awakened heart. So, or actually, it means the awakened mind, heart of compassion and wisdom. And citta actually is not quite the heart. That also actually is an aspect of mind. It's the awakened mind of compassion and wisdom. The Mahayana also develops a brand new idea called the Buddha nature, or a Tathagata Garbha, which is the notion that there is some inner quality of knowingness or enlightenment, which is at the core of all sentient beings, and it is obscured by ignorance. We'll be talking much more about that later. It emphasizes the union, the synonymous of compassion, or great. We'll talk about what does compassion mean. The union of that plus wisdom. You can't have wisdom without compassion, and you can't have compassion without wisdom. What is wisdom? The understanding of the deep identification with the true nature of reality. That's wisdom. The goal is to engage enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. All right, not just the elect or the saved or maybe the monks, but every being that's locked in this sense of pleasure and pain. As Mahayana developed, they developed the concept of a bodhisattva, which is a being which exhibits an elaborate quality of bodhicitta. And I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but it's a semi-divine being that's forsaken Buddhahood for the sake of compassion. It's called a bodhisattva. And the Mahayana, as I hinted, assumes that enlightenment is a very gradual process and may take many lifetimes to achieve. Note that, because the Vajrayana begs to differ. The later schools of Buddhism says, no, you can do it in a single lifetime if you're willing to put in the work. Okay, but Mahayana, I notice in many, like the Tibetan Buddhist Center, they don't talk about it, but the traditional understandings of Mahayana is that you're basically accumulating two things, merit and wisdom. And it's not just about this life, it's in many, many subsequent lives, in endless numbers of relationships with other beings. That's the big picture that we're talking about. That's what you're working towards. So to maybe sort of underline this difference, these two different notions of Buddhism, I found on the internet a picture of really the Hinayana, the original notion of what a Buddhism was about and what the Buddha was doing. This is the ascetic, not aesthetic, but ascetic Buddha, meditating underneath his tree. He's on a type of thing, a grass, instead of like a lotus flower, he's sitting on something called kushya grass, which is a kind of long grass in India, which I guess the yogis would use to make a little mat to sit on. And notice he's gaunt and he's been fasting. The traditional monastic path of the Hinayana is quite austere and is about really forgetting about, overcoming all your normal needs, your egoistic needs and desires. And there he is surrounded by the arhats, all of his immediate disciples who are with him are meditating and learning to overcome their attachments and achieve nirvana. And then on the right over there, you see the Mahayana ideal of what Buddhism is about. And you see Buddha there with his begging bowl. Okay, you can see that other thing, that hand that he's touching the earth. The story of the Mahayana story of the Buddha is that when he achieved enlightenment, Mara, the great god of temptation, of illusion, of ignorance, challenged him and said, you know, who says you're the Buddha? And he says, the earth is my witness. And I asked my teachers once, what did that mean? And I didn't get a good answer. By earth, I think he means what the term for you Buddhist geeks out there is the alaya vijnana. It's the fundamental nature of consciousness. He's touching the root of consciousness. He said, that what makes me Buddha. And you see him, he's being addressed by various demons, the Maras, and celestial entities, Asvaras and all that. And I think he's being tempted right there. It's a little like he's being tempted away from his goal of achieving enlightenment. You see within his little mandala, he's surrounded by Buddha fields, as they would call it later, I think maybe in the Vajrayana. That is actually the world the way it looks if you're acting and thinking like a Buddha. So, what is Buddhism then? If all of Buddhism it rests on a common base of ideas and philosophy, well, what are they? Well, Buddhism is very vast, and there is this idea, concept of the 4 seals and marks of Dharma. And I'm going to spend a little time on that because it gives you the whole heart of both the Hinayana, but also the Mahayana development of the basic Hinayana philosophy. It gives you some of the Mahayana refinements. So the Buddhists also say that if you're listening to a teaching and it sounds familiar, but you're not quite sure what it's about, they say this is how you can recognize whether it is authentic Buddhist teachings. If that's something that you need to have, is that these are the real teachings of the Buddha. All right. They also say that if somebody proposes something, I'll give you an example. Somebody said there's something called some kind of deity which is controlling your life. They say that's actually not really Buddhist teachings. So in any case, the 4 seals, and I'm going to spend some time on this, is all compounded things are impermanent. I'll spend some time on this. All ego-conditioned emotions are painful. All phenomena are empty of an actual or independent existence. And finally, nirvana is peace or the end of personal suffering. In some versions of these marks or seals of Dharma, it's only the first 3. They don't include nirvana. But I want to go over each one because, again, this is the heart of Buddhism. The first one, and these are a little difficult to get. I would suggest that you should spend your whole career in meditation, spiritual practice, trying to understand what impermanence is. What does compounded mean? It means anything that's made out of other things, like your face. Your face is made of, your skin, your brain, if you got facial features, if you have, if you got facial hair, something like that, your eyes, your nose, it's made out of parts. Each one of, anytime something that's assembled, sooner or later, it's going to become disassembled. It will fall apart. And anything from mountains that is made out of dirt and sand and a little bit of life forms on top of it, and sooner or later it begins to fall apart. It's subject to erosion. It's subject to things that will come apart. It may be thousands or even millions of years, but sooner or later it will come apart. Anything that's assembled or compounded from other parts of things is subject to decay and change. This sounds duh, but if you really get into it, it's a real serious thing. You think, well, what about this notion of justice? That never changes. And you think, really? Was there always a concept of justice? What about before there were people? Well, maybe not then. And you think, in all cultures, do they have a concept of justice? You think, well, probably not. Do all people have a concept of justice? Well, they have different concept of justice. So it's not really necessarily the same thing. And what is justice? It's comprised of a whole bunch of subcategories that everybody disagrees about. So you begin to go, oh my God, it's more complicated. So maybe justice itself, even an abstracted idea like justice or love or concern, even that might evolve and change. It is not really an eternally permanent. So corollary, any phenomenon we experience is a temporary and changing situation. Okay, the story I like very much is there was a very high-level Tibetan monk And he was sitting in one of these big conventions with diplomats and everything around him. And some well-educated and well-meaning person next to him leaned over and says, Rinpoche, that's the name, precious jewel, that's the term for a high-level lama in Tibetan Buddhism. Rinpoche, well, what's the essence of Buddhism? Can you tell me? And you're expecting this Tibetan Lama to say something like love or compassion. No, the Tibetan Lama just leaned over and said, everything changes. And in fact, that's, in certain ways, the heart of Buddhism. Everything changes. You're happy now? Trust me, sooner or later you'll be unhappy. If you're a little cold now, sooner or later you'll be a little too hot. Everything that you're experiencing right now is constantly changing and constantly in motion, constantly evolving from one state to another. So sooner you get certain set of problems fixed, other problems come up, or the situation changes, and you have to respond differently. It's a fundamental condition of life, and I could go on and on about it, but let's just say it's a subject that you should be constantly meditating on and coming to grips with. What does it mean that everything is changing? Everything changes and is impermanent, except for this very fact of impermanence itself. Even your thoughts and ideas are subject to constant change and flux. Your political ideas are not the same they were 10 years ago. If you're really paying attention, they aren't the same they were a couple of months ago. Everything that you believe is constantly changing. Everything that you see and suspect is constantly changing. It sounds silly, but you say, well, the trees, I'm looking at the room, this room's been here forever. Actually, it's constantly changing because all the objects in it are constantly slowly undergoing decay or change or fading or turning into something else. And in a practical sense, the room that you're in right now doesn't look the way it did 6 months ago. It looks completely different than it did 10 years ago, and it probably didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago. Everything changes. As you begin to meditate this, you aren't even aware of it, but a lot of the reason you're anxious or unhappy about life is that you can't count on anything. Everything's always changing. And the worst thing is your body's always changing. Your thoughts are always changing. Your needs are always changing. And this causes you a lot of anxiety. You're constantly scrambling to try to control the situation. It can't be controlled because it's always changing. Second seal. Sometimes this upsets people, but it's true. All emotions based in ego self is dukkha. And the Buddhist classical formulation use a term I don't like. They say all stained emotions. They mean stained by this notion of selfish grasping. It's a little bit, that doesn't sound right, at least to me. So I'm saying all emotions based in the ego self is dukkha. The ego-based sense of self, what do I mean by that? I mean a perception of self and other. In other words, the way, anytime he says, I like that, let's go there. That's self and other. Let us, that's here, go over there. Don't let that happen. That means other. I'm not like that. I'm that. That's a distinction between self and other. Does an ego always exist? This gets into the nature of self, which I'm going to address later. And I'm going to tell you right now is, no, your ego doesn't always exist. Sometimes on a roller coaster ride, you are just like so excited. You're not thinking, gee, this is so great. You're just going, ah! Your ego doesn't exist. You're actually just there. So it's actually like everything else, it's impermanent and it's constantly shifting and changing. So anyway, this ego-based self, I and that, which I'm saying all of your emotions based in that, okay, is going to cause you to be unhappy ultimately. Whatever you, let's say, well, let me go through the 8 worldly concerns. I think these are genius. This is called the 8 worldly dharmas or the 8 worldly winds. To me, this is the software program which is organizing our ego-based consciousness. And I've spent a lot of time considering this, and you should too. So it's 8 oppositional, or rather 4 oppositional pairs of 8 ideas. So why are ego-based senses of emotion, why is that always going to cause you anxiety and suffering and never work outness, which is dukkha? Like and dislike. Well, anything you like means you don't like the opposite. I want, chocolate ice cream. That means, and you get served, vanilla or strawberry. You feel a momentary sense of disappointment. Okay? I like you. That means there's somebody else that you don't like quite as much. And there's other people you maybe don't like. You aren't neutral. Pleasure and pain. Anything that causes you great joy and pleasure is going to hurt you when it's taken away. And it will eventually go away. Everything does. Then you're going to be unhappy, or you're going to experience momentary dissatisfaction. Conversely, you're unhappy and in pain right now. It won't last forever. Okay? Gain and loss. You make a lot of money, but you lose your best friend. You get a new car, all right? But you have to pay more insurance. Everything is like any kind of these opposition like that based on self and other. It's going to cause you some degree of dissatisfaction. And finally, praise and blame. I think it's amazing, but if we consider it as the Buddhists teach us to do, dispassionately, let's say somebody says, you're a horrible person. It's almost impossible not to feel like, what? Why? What's the matter with you? Or gee, am I? It's almost impossible not to feel something painful from that. It is possible to get to a dispassionate state where you're not affected by the 8 worldly winds. That's one of the goals of Buddhism. Somebody comes up to you and say, you're a horrible person. All you think of is like, that poor person is drawing distinctions between things they don't like and things they do like, and that causes them a lot of pain. For myself, I could care less what they think. It's possible to get like that, but for just about all of us, including me, you get bummed out by certain people saying certain things. So anyway, the 8 worldly dharmas, they go on and on, but they are the way our mind responds is like and dislike, me and that. It's going to cause you suffering. If you did not have a me and that, really, I'll go on to this later, if you didn't have an ego sense, you don't experience suffering like that. So the ego self-craving, or tanha, is expressed through these 8 worldly concerns, and that this is suffering. This is Dongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, and he's a sort of a newer generation of Tibetan lamas. He was raised in the West. I think he was raised after the Tibetan diaspora, and I think he was raised in India, trained, and he makes films. So this is what he has to say, and it's worth listening to him because the guy's really thought about this. All emotions are pain, all of them. Why? Because they involve dualism. This is a big subject now. This we have to discuss for a while. From the Buddhist point of view, as long as there is a subject and an object, as long as there is a separation between the subject and object, as long as you divorce them, so to speak, as long as that you think they are independent and that they function as subject and object, that is an emotion, which includes everything, almost every thought that we have. This is worth thinking about. Okay. How wonderful compassion is. It's going to be very hard to have a feeling when when somebody says, I hate this person or that organization or that president. I hate that person. You're going to feel like a conflict between this beautiful compassion you want to feel, and then you hear these other sentiments. That's going to cause you problems because of your ego-based oppositional thinking. Ego-based emotions are based on the separation of self and other. And because we see ourselves as separate from other things, we want them or are repulsed by them. An advanced meditation for those of you who want something, like I want to have more money, I want to be comfortable. Meditate on the fact that finally all those experiences are your experiences. You can choose to have those experiences or not. It's up to you. All right? That's a big topic, but I'll leave it with that. Nobody's making you have those experiences. You're choosing to have those negative experiences. This is the teaching of the second noble truth. It teaches that the cause of suffering is craving or thirst. That means you think there's something that you don't have, that you need in order to have your happiness. That's your decision. That's your decision. Because we divide the world into subject and object, me and everything else, we continually grasp for things we think are separate from ourselves to make us happy. Let's say you I really need money, and somebody sends you a $1,000 check, and you have a feeling of happiness. Guess what? The need that you had for money was something that you own by yourself. The check that showed up was something you decided was your check. The happiness that you felt is your happiness. That all happened within you, within your experience. You made up the whole story. And the problem with everything is it never lasts because of impermanence. Trust me, at my age right now, there has been so many times where I said, I really need money. I get money. I'm happy for a little while, and then I need something else, or I need more money. It's always been like that. And I'm trying to just finally just get over it. It's like, well, the hell with the whole thing. I mean, I don't care. The money comes and goes. I'm really trying to develop the attitude of dispassion, non-attachment. Money's there, great. Money's not there, all right. But working on it. Third seal of the 4 seals or truths of Dharma. This is the tough one, emptiness. All phenomena are empty of a truly independent existence. Nothing has intrinsic or inherent existence, including ourselves, and relates to the teachings of one of the cardinal teachings of Buddhism, anatta, or the non-existence of an independent, separate self. I'm going to be spending more time discussing what on earth does that mean. All compounded objects, situations, and even ideas are composed of collections and assemblages of other things. They exist only, the Buddhist term is conceptual designations, as names only. The example that popped in my mind is I used to work at an art school. So everybody says, you know, this art school, PAFA, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. What was it composed of? Well, there was all these different people with different ideas and needs and opinions, and they all sort of had an idea of what PAFA, this art school, was. It was composed of buildings. It was composed of an identity in Philadelphia. It was composed of a history, which everybody had in their minds. Everybody had a slightly different history. It was actually, I could go on and on and on. It was a collection of fragments, like little pieces that are all stuck together. If you took a couple of the pieces away, you would have a very different place. If you took all the buildings away from the academy, it wouldn't be quite the academy at all in the same way. It's actually just something we call a whole bunch of junk stuck in a way. I'm going to say that collection of stuff is the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. I got a little bit more scary one. Everything, including you, only exists in an endless and universal state of independent arising. This is the great insight of the Buddha. The Buddha said, you know what? You really experience the universe. The Buddha said, I'm pretending the Buddha said this because we all do. You really think the universe is composed of houses and trees and people and cars and movie stars and televisions, and you think you have a past and you are what your name is. And you think all these things. Think about it. I'm going to use the example of me because it'll also get to the anatta, the non-existent and independent separate self. What is this, which I'm calling Jeff, me? Well, it's trillions and trillions of individual cells. Each one of those cells are comprised, we're told, of other entities. Mitochondria, for example, which are actually separate life forms, which originally migrated into the original cells. And I have all the bacteria in my gut for which helped me digest food. So I'm composed of a whole colony of different kinds of organisms of different kind of pieces. All right, I'm also composed of phosphorus and oxygen and nitrogen, all these elements that came together to make this body. Guess what? I take stuff which has been lying around, food. I just get it out of packages or I pick it up off a place. I go in a store and I buy it. I put it in my mouth and then I say it turned into me somehow. And part of it, of course, I poop out and then it's no longer me. It was me, but now it's not me. So I'm a permeable membrane. Without being able to breathe and take oxygen, my body, I've been told, actually I'll be pretty uncomfortable, will die. Well, I think, well, actually my body isn't me. It's a collection of fragments. It's a collection of processes. Okay, and I'll talk more about this. I could say the same thing about my ideas. Everything I've ever thought is just stuff that I've learned. I wasn't born knowing all this stuff about Buddhism. It came from outside, and now I think it's me. So we exist as conceptual designations. Interdependent arising means there's nothing that's independent from anything else. I'm very happy that physics has moved away from the old Newtonian idea of physics, that there was like planets and there was trees and people. And now we realize it's quantum theory. It's all just based on sort of probabilities of arisings. Things might happen this way, but they might have also happened this way. They happen to happen this way because of all the other causes and conditions that cause it to happen. I'm going to talk more about this later because it's deep. It's a big concept. So the traditional analogy of the chariot is something from Buddhist time. And the chariot, well, I'm going to update it. Our chariots are cars. So here's the way the Buddhists use it, with the mere conceptual designation. By the way, emptiness has levels of understanding to emptiness. It is maybe the central topic in Buddhism is emptiness. So I'm starting out with the Hinayana and Mahayana explanations for what emptiness is about. So I said impermanence. Emptiness is because everything's changing constantly. So how can you say that things have eternal, self-existent, continuing identities? They don't, because everything's changing. I'm also talking about that everything is just mere conceptual designations, just collections of stuff that we call certain things. And I'm going to think of it, I hope that will make you kind of go, huh, this is, I'll use a car, but to make it simpler, I'm going to use the hand. It's the same issue. So I'm looking at something, a collection of parts I'm calling the hand. Okay, so this is interesting. Now, on this collection of parts, my hand is made out of fingers, it's made out of the palm, it's made out of my thumb, my index finger, you know, it's attached to my wrist. On my little pinky, where is hand in my little pinky? You'd say, well, there is no hand in your little pinky. Hand only shows up when everything goes all together. Okay, so is the hand in my palm? They said, no, that's just a fragment. That's just a piece of the collective. Oh, okay. Is the hand then in the whole collection? Yeah, that's your hand. They said, but it's in none of the parts, right? So where did the hand come from? There is no hand here. That's something you just called it. And you're saying, well, that's kind of stupid. It's not actually, it's pretty cool. Think about it. Everything's like that. Everything that's made out of parts is just something you said it was that way. Somebody else may disagree or not even care. You understand? Everything is just what you think it is. It's not really that way. In fact, there's nothing really there. It's just atoms and molecules. It's just energy. It's just colored light. There's nothing there. It's stuff that you make up. The Buddhists say it's causes and conditions. My hand is a hand now because the fingers are in the right place. It's alive. The bones came together. Hands. It's made out of, you know, water and carbon and something else. You could make little piles of stuff out of it, or God forbid, it could be all chopped up, and then it's not going to be, you know, just be parts of the hand. The hand will be gone. 100 years from now, this is going to be nothing. It'll just go. It'll be dispersed. This hand, now it's a fist. What happened to the hand? Now it's a hand. What happened to the fist? It's subject to causes and conditions. They come together in a certain way, and that's what makes it real. I repeat, it only comes together in a certain way. That's the only thing that makes it real. Buddhists call it causes and conditions. They have to come together. If something changes, and it will, it comes apart, and it's no longer what you said it was. the house falls apart. You take the timber, you build it a certain way, the house comes together. No house, no more house. Everything's just a mere conceptual designation. So this is, I like this guy, Guy Armstrong. I found him on the internet and I actually bought his book a couple of days ago. All sense contacts. What does he mean by that? It was pointed out to me that everything we know has been coming in through our senses. Ears, eyes, nose, tongue, taste, and the sixth sense, the mind, the ability of the mind to form concepts and ideas. We know everything through the senses. Everything we've learned, everything we sense out there come through the senses. So all sense contacts, which are the core experience, the core constituents of human experience, we get everything we know from our senses, are characterized by frail, fleeting, ungraspable nature. If we look closely, we have to say that there's something there, like we see something. But that something appears only for a moment. We close our eyes and it's gone. As the Dalai Lama said about the unsatisfactoriness of all conditioned things, that means things that are subject to causes and conditions, all conditioned things, sankhara dukkha, all sense experience is disintegrating moment by moment. A sense impression comes into being and then it vanishes. For example, right now, your eye senses are constantly absorbing light information. You think you're looking at a constant object. You're not. It's just chemical, electrical firings in the brain. There's nothing there. You are under the illusion that there's something happening. It's just constantly fleeting, coming and going. As Suzuki Roshi put it, everything is in flowing change. Nothing exists but momentarily in its present form and color. One thing flows into another and cannot be grasped. You should, when you do your meditations, just get into it. The term for people of my generation and my age is just grok it. It's cosmic. It'll both scare you to death, but actually also it'll fill you with joy. Everything is just this constantly flickering. There was a wonderful quote from the same Suzuki Roshi, a pioneer Zen teacher, wonderful teacher. Everything is a flashing in a vast phenomenological void. Everything is a flashing in a vast phenomenological void. What actually comes into presence, it comes so briefly, it can be hardly called a thing at all. And if we look closely, we can see that it never actually existed substantially enough to even be called an object. It's just a fleeting, flimsy flash. In the words of Nagarjuna, who was a great Tibetan yogi and philosopher, one of the most important teachers in the Buddhist canon, in the words of Nagarjuna, that to which language refers is denied, means it doesn't exist. That to which language refers, like yourself, your car, your family, your hopes and dreams, that to which language refers is denied because an object experienced by the mind is denied. It means that anything you experience in your mind, which means everything, is subject to cause and conditions. It's just electrical firings in your brain. And the next minute or two, you might change your mind or have a very different experience. It's constantly changing. It's cosmic. It's Buddhism. It's what they mean by emptiness. And it's, as I said, shocking, worthy of a lifetime of study, and ultimately liberating because you're not stuck with anything. So what does Buddhism mean when we say we have no self? Okay, the Hinayana insight is that the mind is comprised of independent processes called skandhas. This is the Buddha's great insight. People said, what about the soul, Buddha? What incarnates? You know, what gets to go to heaven? What about the soul? The Buddha said, I don't see any soul in there. And I don't see any personality, which is incarnating from life to life to life. Like, you know, all those people who say, in another life, I was, this person or that person. I don't see a personality that incarnates from life to life. What I see are what he called skandhas, which means heaps. We would call them processes. And in fact, cognitive science is abundantly verified. I think I read that the ankara, the I self, is actually a little strip of brain tissue right here. That's what's running the whole movie of your life. Like, I got to get up and go to work. Who said that? The little movie portion of your brain tissue right up to there. The Buddha said this is all just psychological processes, skandhas. They have no real reality. There's no separate soul or Atman that transmigrates from life to life. But the Mahayana teaches that individual mind streams do exist in a relative way. And I'm mindful of the time, but this is so important to explain this. You see, I was under the delusion, which I know that Losum Sankten, our teacher at the Tibetan Buddhist Center, has actually also agreed with this. He's corrected this or substantiates this. We don't belong to a big universal mind. We have separate karmic mind streams. We're collections of karmas. The actual personality, which we believe and we cherish, which, by the way, our personalities change all the time. They change quite a bit since we were children. They change quite a bit from the last year or from the last month. They constantly change. It's the analogy I like that I just remembered is it's like billiard balls. When the billiard ball strikes the other billiard ball, the other one starts going. What got transferred? The energy, the potential energy. There's nothing physically connecting one to the other. One caused the other one to move. Buddhism says that we're actually a whole bunch of causes and conditions, extending from ourself into our social relationships, into our relationships with our experiences with others and with our jobs, with everything. We're this big collection of causes and effects. When we die, that sense of cause and effect continues to operate and generates the next set of experiences after death. So we don't die in that sense, but the potential energy that we are, all those energies, that continues through a process called time or through causality. The awareness of I-ness persists. Now, this is a little complicated, these last 3 bullet points here that you can see. And this is the one part of the lecture that I'm giving that is a little bit of my experience and my interpretations of the teachings. Most of this is I'm giving you straight Buddhist talk. So the awareness of the I-ness, like you say, but I know I exist because here I am. And in fact, Losung once said, he said, don't get the wrong idea. He didn't say, don't get the wrong idea about no self. As Losung Samten said, he says, of course there's a self. What else got you up in the morning and got you here? Something, the I got you here. Even if it's an illusory I or a temporary I, is still something operating. We have something in us which we feel it's me. Look, I'm going like this. I do it automatically. This is me. We touch ourselves. All right, okay. You touch yourself and say, I'm here. Even when you begin to experience, and you'll do this in practice, everything is constantly changing and impermanent. And you should do this as a Buddhist. The I-ness is still here. Your body may change, your thoughts may change, your emotions may change, your opinions may change, your sense of Buddhism may change, but you somehow feel like I am here. So what is that? Well, in our ordinary, what we call our dualistic, ego-stained quality of self, we see it as subject and object. There's me, then there's my emotions, or me, then there's the world. There's me and all my relationships. I'm going to tell you, the last line is something which I'm working with in my own practice very actively right now. Ultimately, you realize that sense of the I is everything. Oh, I'm here. But by the I, you mean awareness itself. And I want to just leave that because that's what we're going to get into with Dzogchen. We're going to talk a lot about that stuff in Dzogchen. Right now, what's the difference then between the way the Hinayana, the Theravada, and the Mahayana understand this nature of the self, the Anatman? So the doctrine of non-self is explained by a great scholar of Theravada. And this is pretty severe, so listen carefully. According to the Buddha's teachings, it is as wrong to hold the opinion, I have no self, which is the annihilationist theory, as to hold the opinion, I have a self, which is the eternalist theory, because both are fetters, meaning bondage. They arise out of a false idea, the egoistic idea that I am, I have these needs. You are you, and I am I. The correct position with regard to the question of anatta, which is the doctrine of non-self, is to not take hold of any opinion or views, but to try to see things objectively as they are without mental projections. That means you see, what does that mean? It means when I see somebody on TV and I say, I hate that guy, that's a mental projection. If I simply say, I'm looking at a television and there is an image of a man there, that's much more objective. I'm withholding my opinions, my projections on it. What a beautiful day. The beautiful stuff is the stuff I'm projecting onto what's happening, which is just a day. Okay? So, the correct position is not to take a hold of any opinion or views, but to try to see things objectively as they are, without all those projections. To see what we call the I, or being, is just the combination of physical and mental aggregates, which are working together interdependently in a flux of momentary change within the laws of cause and effect. Okay? What I think I am is a momentary flash, a combination of my education, my mood, what I ate in the morning, my state of my relationships with others, my education, my physical health. All that stuff is just changeable elements of this bundle of stuff that I call, that's happening, that I'm calling me. It's a flux of momentary change within the law of cause and effect, but there's nothing permanent or everlasting or unchanging or eternal in the whole of existence. As I stated earlier, the only thing, according to the Theravadan view, the only thing that is permanent is impermanence. Okay? But Buddhism, the Mahayana has a subtly different flavor to it, which is very important. The Buddha nature, which is an idea that the Mahayana tended to interpret. They aren't denying Hinayana. It's like an elaboration on an idea. It's like they're saying, yes, but the Buddha nature is the immutable and eternal nature of all beings. A teaching not found in the Theravada. What is that immutable and eternal nature of all beings, which they call the Buddha nature? Okay. That is, in addition to compassion, that's the big quest in your Mahayana education. What is the Buddha nature? What is this immutable and eternal nature of all beings? So the Mahayana doctrine of sunyata, or this emptiness, which I talked about earlier, I've been talking about, it said, the Mahayana agrees with the Theravada. They said, yes, phenomena have no existence of their own. They're empty of a permanent self. Everything is just a series of causes and conditions that are constantly evolving and changing. Everything's subject to flux and change and impermanence. In sunyata, there is neither reality nor non-reality, only relativity, interdependent arising. In other words, just because I say this, hand, fist, that doesn't mean that hand doesn't exist. Yeah, there's the hand. It's just this subject to all these causes and conditions. It doesn't have an independent existence apart from all the things that can constitute hand. Sunyata is also an absolute reality that is all things and all beings unmanifested. That sounds wild. Fist, hand, me, you, all of these have some kind of existence. Why? Because we're experiencing them. Right? We're experiencing them, so they must have some kind of existence. Mahayana then posits two ways of conceiving of what's happening to us, our reality. The absolute, which is something's happening, even though we don't know quite how it's happening, and the relative, which is the ordinary, object-oriented way we experience reality. Okay? The central doctrine of the absolute and relative expressions of reality is enshrined in the Heart Sutra, or the Prajnaparamita Sutra. That's the most important sutra of the Mahayana canon. And central to the Heart Sutra is the teachings that form is emptiness, emptiness is form, form is no other than emptiness, emptiness is none other than form. And I've got to pay attention to my time. Otherwise, I would read to you passages of the Heart Sutra. They say no eye, no ear, no nose, tongue. What they're saying is that none of those things have an independent existence. They all are conditional. I'll give you quick an illustration to help you in your meditations on the Heart Sutra. All right? I'm looking at a computer screen. I have the organs of perception. This is from the Heart Sutra, the eye, the act of seeing, and the thing being seen. Ponder this, grok it. Can the eye function as an eye without seeing and an object of something to be seen? No. It's inert. The organ of perception, in order for it to function, needs to process the activity of seeing. Can seeing happen without an eye and something to be seen? No. Seeing won't happen without this and the object. Can an object be seen without the act of seeing and the thing to be seeing it? No. In order for an object to exist as something being perceived or seeing, it has to have the object of observation and the process of seeing. See, they're all interlinked. You can't separate them. They're all interdependently arisen. Heart Sutra talks about that. It's the Heart Sutra was also AKA, it was somebody's translated and called it the Heart Attack Sutra. And the reason he said is, I don't know if it's, the legend is that when the Buddha was proclaiming the teachings of the Heart Sutra to his assembled monks, they said, what are you saying? That nothing exists at all independently. He said, then how can anything happen? And the Buddha simply said, well, that's transcendent wisdom. That's how things happen, through transcendent wisdom. And they go, what? What is it? Nothing exists. And like they had a heart attack. They wanted to believe in virtue and right and wrong, and that there was something called nirvana that someday they would get to. And Buddha was just saying, listen, all this stuff is empty. And he blew their heads. The fourth seal is nirvana's peace. Okay? Nirvana is beyond extremes. I was reading about nirvana last night. This is the goal, the Theravadan goal. Again, the scholar of Theravadan, nirvana is beyond all terms of duality and relativity. It's beyond our conceptions of good and evil, right or wrong, existence and non-existence. Think about it. If nirvana is something we really can't think about, it's beyond any kind of conception we might have of something that we want or something that's bad, that's good or evil, or even that doesn't exist or does exist. How do you grasp that? Dongsa Kensei Rinpoche, who was a Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhist, Dongsa Kensei says, in many philosophies and religions, the final goal is something that you can hold on to and keep. The final goal is the only thing that truly exists. Like nirvana is the only thing that truly exists. Heaven's the only thing that truly exists. But nirvana is not fabricated, so it's nothing to be held on to. It's not compounded of other entities. It's not subject to causality. It's referred to as beyond extremes. And different schools of Buddhism tie themselves into knots trying to give a definition to this nirvana. But fundamentally, the Buddha taught that forget it, because any kind of concept you have of nirvana, okay, is just going to be a concept, and that is going to be subject to impermanence like everything else. So don't even try. Don't speculate. That hasn't stopped the Buddhists from speculating, however. So here's the kind of thing they talk about. In Sanskrit, nirvana literally means to extinguish. And this can really sound alarming because it sounds to people like the goal of Buddhism is to like obliterate yourself. But that's not what it's about. The Buddha used the term to mean you're going to be liberated from your ignorance, unbound from your suffering. Nirvana is liberation from samsara. And what the samsara in the old fashioned, the original definition of samsara is just this endless experience of life where things, you're born, you suffer, you work, you decay, and eventually you die, and then you're reborn, and you go through the whole thing over and over and over again. And physical life in ancient India was not pretty. We suffered from anxiety. They suffered from, scurvy and terrible diseases and death and childbirth and, real physical horrors. But samsara has other meanings. And I think contemporarily, I think a better way to understand samsara is our confusion about our attachment. We really want things to be a certain way they are, but everything's impermanent. Everything's changing. So things are not the way they want to. We're in dukkha. That's what samsara. We're lost in dukkha. We want things to be different than the way they are. And we always want things to be different than the way they are. If you say, well, I don't agree with that. Oh, I just caused you suffering. See? You were content, and then as soon as I said something you didn't agree with, you said, I don't like that. You're just stuck in samsara. And finally, nirvana is not a place. The various schools of Buddhism understand nirvana in many different ways, but it's not like heaven. It's not some place you go to. The Buddhists have this notion of bardos. It's not like something you transmute into. It's more like just instead of state of existence, I'll say it's a state of being. Buddha said that anything we might say or imagine about nirvana is going to be wrong because it's utterly different than the normal way we process experience. I'll use it, way we process our experience. For this reason, it defies definition because our language is designed around dualism. We automatically categorize things as I and other. And nirvana has nothing to do with it. Nirvana is beyond space, time, and definition. So we talked about nirvana a lot, but so what is this Mahayana notion of enlightenment? That's even harder to talk about. Enlightenment is a kind of a Mahayana concept, but it's understood in most cases to be gained in a gradual process over thousands of lifetimes, where you gradually gain merit, that's spiritual virtue, and insight. That's deeper and deeper understanding of this nature of impermanence, the nature of anatta, non-self, all those basic Buddhist principles. They gradually accumulate over many, many lifetimes. Enlightenment is a state of perfect knowledge or wisdom. This is by a very well-regarded spiritual teacher and a long-term Buddhist and friend of the Dalai Lama. Enlightenment, this is Matthew Ricard. Enlightenment is a state of perfect knowledge or wisdom combined with infinite compassion. Knowledge in this case does not mean merely the accumulation of data or a description of the world of phenomenon down to the finest details. Enlightenment is an understanding of both the relative mode of existence, the way I described it earlier, the way in which things just appear to us and happen to us, and this ultimate notion of reality, which is the true nature of these same appearances, a knowledge of emptiness. This includes our own minds, which are also empty, as well as the external world. Such knowledge is the basic antidote to ignorance and suffering. I'll put it in a nutshell. Wisdom is completely grokking the union of relative and absolute reality. This is a hand. It both exists and it does not exist at the same time. And you have to completely respect both senses of reality. It exists, but only in a relative conditioned way. All right? You got to grok that about everything to the deepest extent. Enlightenment, another teacher of mine said, is a situation of being of infinite benefit to beings. And I've thought about that for years, since my teacher Jay Lippman told me that. So enlightenment about Mahayana Buddhism too. Mahayana emphasizes the higher goal of enlightenment for all sentient beings. That's the way it distinguishes itself from the Hinayana. The Mahayana ideal is to become a bodhisattva who strives to liberate all beings from the cycle of birth and death. Mahayana considers all physical forms to be void of an intrinsic self, a teaching called sunyata, which means emptiness, and individual autonomy. You don't exist as yourself. Therefore, according to Mahayana, individual enlightenment is not possible because there's nothing there to be enlightened. It's a delusion to think that you're a separate individual self. You're part of an energy process with all other beings in existence. You're not separate. Your existence is codependent, co-arisen with all other beings in all other worlds. You are part of the universe. You're intrinsic to the universe. You can't be enlightened unless the entire universe becomes enlightened. So the ideal is to be able to enlighten all beings together, not just out of it, not only out of a sense of compassion, but because that's the only way it can be. And as you become closer and closer to being a bodhisattva, which I'm going to talk about later, you'll understand that greater and greater. There's no such thing as an individual salvation or enlightenment. There's only collective enlightenment. So again, to compare the two approaches to liberation or enlightenment between Theravada and Mahayana, they have different goals for practice as well as more subtle differences of interpretation. Okay, Theravadan considers the Atman, the sense of individual self, to mean that an individual's ego or personality is a delusion. Once you're freed of this delusion, you will enjoy the bliss of nirvana. And Theravadan emphasizes the individual personal pursuit of salvation. In Theravada, supreme attainment is represented by the Arhat, a spiritual master who has achieved enlightenment by his or her own efforts, and the Arhats, even the legendary ones, were human beings. On the other hand, for the Mahayana, the ideal is the Bodhisattva. So what is the Bodhisattva ideal? A Bodhisattva is a being, divine or human, who upon reaching the threshold of enlightenment, chooses instead, remember this is many, 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 many lifetimes, and this is the Mahayana teachings, many, many lifetimes. There's 10 levels of the Bodhisattva, so they say. Bhumis, they're called. 10 levels. As they approach perfect, complete grasping of the emptiness of reality and the way things are codependently arisen, the reality, absolute and relative. As they reach a perfect understanding of this, they deliberately hold back because of their deep compassion for beings, which they still, to some strange way, consider as being in need of salvation. Okay? They stand behind and during endless cycles of life, death, and rebirth in order to help all other beings achieve enlightenment. This act of self-sacrifice, delaying the personal liberation, the Bodhisattva takes a great vow of dedication to this supremely compassionate ideal. It takes the Bodhisattva's vow, which happens over and over and over again, and which some of you have taken the Bodhisattva's vow. The celestial Bodhisattvas are among the stars of the pantheon of Mahayana Buddhism. The best known of them, the objects of profound veneration and devotion. Even the highest Buddhist masters, who actually have understood things, they're Bodhisattvas themselves, they still venerate beings like, well, right behind me, I have a little statue, I don't know if you can see it, called a Rupa. It's a statue of Green Tara over there, who I have on my altar. She's been there forever. And behind me is actually, that's the image of the Buddha, but an object of veneration. Not treated as just a regular guy like me who happens to be awake, but I'm treating it as an object of a symbol for enlightenment itself. The path of the Bodhisattva is open to human beings who may take a great vow, the Bodhisattva's vow, and dedicate themselves to the benefit and liberation of all beings. That's what we do every day at the Tibet Buddhist Center, or you guys do, when you take the Bodhisattva's vow, or when you take actually, what's it called, a pledge towards, you're doing this, you do your spiritual practices for the sake of all other sentient beings, for the benefit of all, not just for yourself. The Bodhisattva, from the original Indian ideal, evolved and muted for the Mahayana spread, and these are two examples. That magnificent image from China, Bodhisattva, I think that's from the Met, and the other one I suspect is Japanese. I just wanted to show it, the ideal. The other image of the Japanese Buddha there is all those hands of the Bodhisattva, is all those helping hands. That is a being, a spiritual being, which is completely dedicated to the welfare of all the other beings. It's constantly helping, benefiting others. So, what's entailed? How does a Bodhisattva function? Well, there's actually a term called the 6 paramitas, and they are considered the qualities of a Bodhisattva. And we actually, if we're in the Mahayana, we worked on perfecting these qualities. So there's 6 of them. The first 5 paramitas are the accumulation of merit, and the 6th one refers to the accumulation of wisdom. You remember I said those are the 2 things we're working on acquiring in the Mahayana as we evolve towards the state of being a Buddha in some future life. Okay? Merit, as I said, is spiritual virtue. Wisdom is a deep understanding of how the absolute and relative work together to create reality, and automatically generates compassion. So the first thing we work on is the sense of generosity. Let me just skip ahead. I don't think, I don't have time to go into these in a great deal of things. Let's say generosity can start out very simply, like you just give $1 to that homeless person on the street, you know, and you feel like, oh, gee, that was nice. I feel good about it. And the homeless person just says, you know, thanks. You feel good about that. Right to the idea that I consciously wish to, I don't care about myself anymore. I've dedicated my life and all of my future lives towards the well-being of other beings. That's a big act of generosity, okay? So it starts out wherever you are and it can become gigantic. Same thing with discipline. That's your sila, or perfection of your ethical activities. Ones we all agree with, like non-harm and compassion, and how to be honest and not to lie. Start out little things, all right? Try not to yell at your roommate. Ends up being big things, where you vow that you will always tell the truth no matter what. You want a spiritual discipline, try to always tell the truth. Patience. Starts out with little things like not getting angry when somebody cuts you off in line. Ends up being big things. The infinite patience that, like taking care of someone who's sick or ill, or trying to take care of a spiritual master, which can require enormous amounts of patience, okay? Diligence is a feeling of just really loving, being dedicated to spiritual activities, spiritual service. And it is a joyousness, but really experience the joyous. If you're doing advanced sadhana, if you're doing a lot of spiritual practice and they don't bring you joy, you're doing something wrong. It brings you joy. And the higher levels of service you offer, the greater the degree of joy. Finally, meditative concentration is all that stuff we talked about, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and also the stages of samadhi, which I talked about last week, where you gradually transcend this ordinary emotion, thought-ridden mind and experience higher levels of awareness than you ever suspected possible. And you finally begin to really experience wisdom, which is what the Bodhisattvas are able to. They're the ones that experience reality through transcendent insight. Prajna, the term is. Okay, those are the 6 paramitas. It's a big subject in Buddhism. And finally, we're going to spend a little bit more time with another aspect of what the Mahayana considers to be the heart of spiritual practice. It's the 4 immeasurables. They're called immeasurables because they can start out very small and sort of personal oriented, and they're infinite. They go be larger and larger and larger as you develop spiritually. They also exist in Indian philosophy, the Brahma Viharas, the abode of Brahma. Brahma is like the king of the gods, but also he's a little bit synonymous with absolute reality. Okay, so the 4, and I'm going to spend time on them, is the loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. The first one, metta, or loving kindness, is central to all Buddhist practice, Mahayana and the Theravadan, as in all 4 of these are. It means benevolence, loving kindness, friendliness, goodwill, and an active and charitable interest in others. Please don't be mean to yourself, because you're not always friendly, charitable, loving to everybody and everything. If you were a bodhisattva right now, you wouldn't be listening to me. You would actually be helping me deliver this lecture. That's what you'd be doing. All the bodhisattvas are. So be kind to yourself. Will help you be kind to others. There are meditations to help you learn this. As my teacher, Jay Lippman, he said, we aren't born with loving kindness. We have to learn it. And we overcome our vexation, our impatience with others, and our obsession with me, me, me. It takes time. You have to be, nice about it to yourself as well as others. The enemy, the opposite of metta, is hatred or ill will, and that's what metta overcomes. The near enemy, and this is a little subtle thing, is it may look like metta, but it really is not. It's attachment to greed or envy. And the image that came to my mind when I was writing this was, you want to see a deep Dharma movie, is Gone with the Wind. And if you remember our wonderful Scarlett O'Hara, played by, a wonderful English actress, Vivian Leigh. At one point, she married a guy for his money, and then he gets killed. And so she takes, there's a charity to raise money for the cause. And she sort of takes off her wedding ring, Just there, you take it, as if she was being virtuous. And she hated, you didn't like the guy, she could care less. It was like, it was actually based on her greed and envy of those people that were making authentically charitable acts. And so, again, loving kindness can be extended to all beings, in all levels of existence. And Gone with the Wind, if you'll remember, it's worth seeing this movie again. Scarlett O'Hara and the woman that she ends up deeply admiring, and a woman who tries to teach Scarlett O'Hara, and that's Melanie Wilkes. She's the opposite, and she really is loving and kind to anybody and everything. And the movie teaches people about Dharma, about life. Second immeasurable is compassion, karuna. What's the difference between compassion and loving kindness and metta? Compassion is the desire to remove harm and suffering from others. But metta is the desire to bring about well-being and happiness. They're related, but they're different. The opposite of karuna is the cruelty and malicious intent. And I urge all of you to, when you hurt others or when you're mean to yourself, okay, give compassion to it. How do you do that? Be aware. Oh, I was cruel, and I vow not to be cruel in the future. Don't beat yourself up over it. That's not very compassionate. Take your own sadness and suffering away from yourself. Be happy. Make other people happy. You'll be surprised. The near enemy of superficially opinion is sentimental pity. Don't say, I feel so sorry for our president. I'm sure he's very unhappy, although I hate the guy. That's not true compassion. That's actually pity or even sarcasm. You understand the difference? You do. Third immeasurable is appreciative joy. And appreciative of rejoicing in the happiness and virtues of all sentient beings. When you see wonderful things, we have sometimes a tendency to get a little cynical, like, oh God, I bet they're miserable, really. No, they're not. They're having a wonderful time. Rejoice in the happiness and well-being of others, okay? If you can do that, rejoice when you see goodness happening in the world. And remember, there's a gigantic amount of goodness happening all the time. People are being nice with each other, or being kind to one another, or good things are happening to people. Rejoice in that. You remember, our ego, think of it as like a limited pie. More for them, that means less for us. That's not the way it is. Be joyful at just abundance. Be joyful at how nice the world can be. Make that, as my teacher once said, if you get good at this, at the appreciative joy, even a turn of the weather will make you smile. Okay? Pray for my teacher. So, to experience pleasure in other people's misfortune or displeasure, that's not very productive to yourself or to others. Okay? The far enemies of joy are jealousy of others, resenting others, the happiness of other beings, like, why not me? It's just making yourself miserable, okay? The joy's far enemy is grasping after a pleasant experience out of an insufficiency or lack. Scarlett O'Hara also. He's saying, let me have it. I want to do it now. Let me do it too. Okay? Because you feel like you're unhappy and you need that happiness to be sufficient. Just allow yourself to feel joy for no reason. Like, what is that? They put the bumper sticker, random acts of kindness. What's wrong with that? Rejoice in the random acts of kindness. And finally, the fourth immeasurable is equanimity. Hard to understand, but the deepest and most profound of all of them. And I'm just going to read this wonderful statement by an American monk, Bhikkhu Bodhi. The real meaning of upekkha, I think it is, I can't pronounce it right, upekkha, is equanimity. It doesn't mean indifference in the sense of unconcern for others. As a spiritual virtue, upekkha means stability in the face of the fluctuations of worldly fortune. It means evenness of mind, unshakable freedom, a state of inner equipoise that cannot be upset by gain or loss. These are the 8 worldly concerns: gain or loss, honor or dishonor, praise or blame, or pleasure or pain. That's the eightfold concerns. Upekkha is freedom from all points of self-reference. It means this is impersonal. It's not about you all the time. It's indifference, not only to the demands of the ego self with its craving for pleasure and positions, not to the well-being of one's, but not to the well-being of one's fellow human beings. I mean, you care about others as much or more than you care about yourself. It's not always about number one. True equanimity is the pinnacle of the four social attitudes that the Buddhist texts call the divine abodes. Those are the Brahma Viharas that I talked about earlier. Boundless loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. The last does not override and negate the preceding three, but perfects and consummates them. Wouldn't that be nice not to be blown out of the water when your check bounces or when you get sick? Wouldn't it be nice not to be blown out with pride and arrogance because you got something nice and you think, well, and somebody else gets jealous of you, okay? And you just feel like, oh, I'm sorry. Or you actually don't tell people about your good fortune because you don't want to make them feel bad. Wouldn't that be nice to have an attitude like that? Instead of trumpeting your own success and putting it on, Facebook, like, I'm really important. You're sensitive. There's nothing wrong with that because you are important. But you don't want to do it in such a way you might hurt somebody's feelings. Karma and reincarnation. This is just a lot of material I'm giving at you, but it's all important. Karma is a gigantic subject, and it deserves an own course. I've taken a couple of courses on karma. The word means action, but it is much more complicated than a cause and effect relationship, okay? Buddhism is all about causality. All results, everything that's happening has a cause. Buddhism does not ascribe to the notion that there are accidents or things just happen for no reason. The cycle of rebirth is determined by karma, which is driven by intentional or volitional actions performed through body, speech, and mind, which lead to future result. Okay, the Buddha defined karma as intention that manifests itself in physical, vocal, or mental form. Let me quickly say, how does it work? I think there's 4 or 5 levels. You have the intention to, let's say, harm somebody. You identify the object. I'm going to harm that person. You've just made potentially a greater karmic result. You initiate the action. Okay, you're going to go, let's say, lie to them in such a way that's going to cause them loss. Okay, so you have the impulse, you identified an object, this is what I'm going to do, then you began to do it. All right, that person, you complete the action, you lie to that person, you cause the damage. And even stronger, that's 4 stages. The 5th is, oh boy, I'm so happy I did this. Now I'm going to reap, I'm going to have all this great stuff because I lied to that person. I tricked them. And now, of course, I'm going to get that, what is it, that mortgage money or whatever like that. I won. You've made really the karma 5 steps. If you have the impulse to harm another, you identify an object, you begin to initiate the action, and then you hold back and say, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, you're going to have much less karma. You could also overcome negative karma. You can sincerely repent the karma. And let me see if I can remember the steps. How can you overcome your negative condition, including stuff that you did long ago? Identify bring it to mind. Look into it carefully. Okay? Acknowledge that you did it. I did it. And then vow, I will never do it again. Even if you do it again, but say, I never do it again. I think those are the actions of how you can repent your karma and you can negate or reduce some of the effects of volitional actions. By the way, the karma that we experience is our situations right now. And I've been taught that we are mostly our situations in life, our relative degree of prosperity or lack thereof, or intelligence, or stations in life, and our interest in spirituality is due to actions we did in previous lives. Rarely, I'm told, does karmic effects create in this lifetime. They say only if it's very strong, positive or negative. Okay, but I want to go back because it's such a big topic. Karma assumes the process of reincarnation. I don't know how you could think of karma working without the idea of reincarnation. I assume, I won't go into it, but I take it for granted, reincarnation. What incarnates, though, is not a soul. Remember, it's the karmic force of a mind stream. The way to think of karma is you're increasing probabilities for certain events to occur. Why are they only probabilities? Because they depend on changes, causes, and conditions. The circumstances have to allow a certain karmic impulse to manifest. It's like you sprinkle a whole bunch of seeds across a field. Only the ones that fall into fertile soil and only those seeds that get watered in sunlight will actually sprout. And even then, birds and animals may eat them. So just broadcasting the seeds are like all the seeds of karma that we have. In future lives or this life, the causes and conditions have to be there for karmic seeds to manifest. Okay? The way death we're taught in the Tibetan tradition is that most of our rebirth is automatic, driven entirely by our accumulated karma. And boy, do the Buddhist and the Tibetans put a lot of emphasis on, please pay careful attention to your deeds, both of body, speech, and mind, because it will influence the situation in which you will be reborn. Only bodhisattvas or highly level realized yogis can choose the way that they are reborn. Samsara, and I'm sorry, I'm taking 2 hours. I'm going to try to wrap it up here. Samsara is, according to traditional teachings, is endless, as I said. You are born into this life in certain circumstances determined by your karma. You work hard, you eventually begin to decay, you die, and you experience rebirth again based on your karma that you have accumulated in this life, either negative karma that you've worked through or positive karma that you have acquired. Okay? But it also refers to just the state, this mental confusion and suffering that we go through in what the Tibetans call the sem, or the dualistic mind. The Tibetan Buddhists call the intermediate states the bardos. There's the bardo of becoming, there's the bardo of death. If you want to read about it, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, I would recommend the edition by Sagyal Rinpoche. Okay, samsara is considered to be dukkha, perpetuated by desire and ignorance, and the resulting karma that completely generates our rebirth again and again among the 6 realms of existence, the 3 higher realms and the 3 lower realms. And samsara only ends when you obtain nirvana, when you stop this craving, which is driving you into karmic rebirths over and over and over again. Quickly, I want to do the 6 realms of beings. It's a lot of fun. I just don't want to run completely out of time here. This is the traditional universe that we incarnate into over and over and over again. And it is specific to Tibetan Buddhism. I'm not 100% sure if other schools of Buddhism talk about the 6 realms. I suspect they do. As it's traditionally taught, when you die, you are drawn or propelled by your own karma into one kind of experience. It is depicted in a certain way just for us to understand it. But I like to think of our cats, which get all the food and all the attention they could ever want, are actually God-level beings. They incarnated as domestic cats to my wife and I, and we take great care of them. So they're God beings. It's a blissful, etheric state. Lots of pleasures, very contented. You don't care about anybody else because you're just having a perfectly nice time. Beverly Hills with none of the drawbacks. The jealous God realm. Sounds like, I'm sorry, I don't want to get political. Sounds like the White House, fueled by ego and aggression. You're warring. You're always striving. You want to overcome. You want to get to where those gods are, where they're happy and content. If you could just get enough power and money, you're going to get there. All right? Fighting. The human realm is all about hopes and dreams. And the problem with being a human being is we only have, if we're really fortunate and lucky, maybe about, we'll live 80 years. Let's say if we're trying to accomplish any big goal, let's say be a successful artist or get somewhere spiritually, we might start at, let's say, 15 to 20 to 25. We might work until 60, 65, 70 till we get too tired and old to do it. That's not much time. In the meantime, all these things are constantly getting in the way. It's very hard for us to get things done, to get what we want. We want to dream. So the desire realm, and it's very frustrating to be a human being. What are the lower realms? An animal realm is, well, they're identified with domestic animals, but I just think living by instincts. People do this too. You know, you go in your little burrow, you come out, you hunt for food or a mate, the hawks are trying to get you, you know, and then you run and you hide. It's a life overcome by sort of things being a little bit beyond your control and always trying to get you. And it's occasionally satisfying, but most of the time it's kind of stressful and difficult in animal life. Not as bad as the hungry ghost realm, where you are eternally needy, never have enough, always want. We all have friends like this. It's like, I'm so unhappy. Why? I don't have any money. I don't have any food. You know, it's like, I have no friends. I want things. And so, but you have this, this, and this. I said, no, I don't, not really. I want more. I need this. Okay. Finally, the hell realm is extremely unpleasant. War conditions, great strife, great difficulty. Everybody's your enemy. Friends betray you. It's the James Bond film. I was listening to one of the wonderful theme songs for a James Bond film. You're always fighting. You're always shooting. You never know who's going to try to get you next. Okay? And some people live in the hell realms. Okay? The Buddhist, this is a traditional depiction of samsara. If you see one of these wheels, and each one sort of is doing a stylized depiction of the different experiences of the different realms. We Westerners would like to think of samsara a little bit more like psychological states. And they're very real for us, and all of us go through those states. Some of us live in one or another of those realms pretty much most of the time or some of the time. And a lot of us go through all of the states over the course of a day or a single meditation. Just pay attention. Finally, what's the essence then of this Mahayana path? And this is his wonderful teacher, Khandro Rinpoche, said the human heart is basically very compassionate, and it is. People want to love. They want to be loved. People want a happy family. People want respect. Everybody actually wants to love others. Think about it. Even Hitler wanted to love others. Didn't know how. Possessed by horrible thought processes. Deep suffering. All the human heart is basically very compassionate. But without wisdom, compassion doesn't work. Wisdom is the openness that lets us see what is essential and most effective. I'm going to add to her, forgive me, Khandro Rinpoche, is we don't have the wisdom to see how deeply we're all connected, how much effect we have on one another, how an incident of cruelty or unkindness in one of us influences the whole collective. How important it is for us to be kind and compassionate, to exhibit mercy and charity. How much that affects the world we live in too. We don't understand that. So we need that wisdom. Then our hearts can be effective. Otherwise, we're kind to the people we like and we're cruel to the people we don't like. That's not very compassionate. That's stupid. That just causes suffering to yourself and others, ultimately. 3 essentials for spiritual, the Mahayana, and for spiritual practice. I want to finish up quickly now. The Heart Sutra. Spend a lot of time with it. It's about emptiness, and there are many translations and many commentaries. Here's one by the Dalai Lama. Shanti Deva, A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is a great spiritual classic. Okay, it's the subject of a sort of a meditation and commentary by the great Pema Chodron. And her book is No Time to Lose. Can't recommend it enough for those of you. And then one book that I adore. It's called The Great Path Awakening. Jandon Control was the great editor, the compiler, the Tibetan monk who sort of put the final version together, but it's actually an ancient Indian spiritual practices. The whole Mahayana is contained in the Great Path of Awakening, including one of the practices I'm going to tell you about right now to conclude is Tonglen. A lot of you have heard about it. Okay, it's described in great detail at how to do it and the context for why you would do it in the Great Path of Awakening. The function of the practice is to reduce selfishness, to increase your experience of the 4 immeasurables. It purifies your karma and gives you merit. And finally, you develop loving kindness and bodhicitta. All four of those things, I guarantee you, will make you much happier. Okay? How do you do it? This is from Pema Chodron. And I'm going to read it to you. It is a very difficult practice. Difficult because at first it's scary. As you begin to understand it better, it gives you great, great joy. Here's how you do it. On the in-breath, you breathe in whatever particular area, group of people, country, or even one particular person. Maybe it's not this global situation. Maybe it's just breathing in the physical discomfort and the mental anguish of chemotherapy. All the people undergoing chemotherapy, the negativity, the harshness, the suffering of others. Breathe that in. Okay? And she goes on and says, you know, we have to find something that we really experience as real for us in the suffering of others. The in-breath, you find some place in the planet or your personal life or something you know about. You breathe in the wish that all those human beings and all those mistreated animals or whatever it is, that they can please be free of that suffering. All right? You breathe that in to yourself. And at first it's very scary. You feel like, oh my God, that's going to happen to me. That's just part of your own suffering. Bring that into your heart and pretend that you're at the heart of a bodhisattva, which you do, you just don't know it yet. Okay? You allow that furnace of love, okay, of compassion. Allow that furnace to convert it. You breathe it back out, your breath out. Then you send it out. Relax. Send enough space so that all people's hearts and minds feel big enough to live with their discomfort. Give everyone the ability to live what they must have to endure. All right? Relieve their anguish by leaving that out. All right? You can breathe out all of those, to all those people who have no food and drink. You can breathe out food and drink. May all beings receive abundance. May all beings be happy. May all beings complete whatever karmas they need to complete in this life and be fulfilled in Buddha's wisdom, however you want to formulate it. Breathe that out. I do this every time I meditate. At the end of every meditation, I have a little formula that I repeat for itself. You breathe in the sufferings of others. You transmute it in your heart of a Buddha. You send it back out with complete loving kindness, with the hope to alleviate, with compassion, to alleviate all the sufferings of others, with great joy at their happiness. You feel that, and finally with great equanimity. This cannot in any way hurt you because you will become at that moment the Buddha itself. You are that loving kindness. You're the heart of bodhicitta. You send that out for all beings. At first, this is difficult because your egoistic mind says that you're crazy. Don't wish bad things for yourself. But when you send out stuff like that, you actually you expand the heart of bodhicitta, the heart of a bodhisattva. You become a bodhisattva by doing this practice. And it is amazingly powerful. It is described in the literature as saying that you are going to experience tremendous joy by doing this. I'm going to tell you that. Don't try to experience joy at first. Allow yourself to experience whatever you're going to experience while you do this practice. So, thank you. I'm sorry it takes 2 hours to do this, but it's a lot of material. Next week, we're going to talk about the Vajrayana, which is a whole different universe of Buddhism entirely. It's full of ritual. It's full of magic, full of power. And finally, it's the experience of your body as this mandala of energy. And I'm looking forward to teaching you next week about, again, this Vajrayana path, the diamond path that promises if you're willing to go there, if you can devote that much spiritual energy to it, it will produce enlightenment in a single lifetime. All right? So I hope I will all see you next time. Sorry I don't have time to do more questions and everything, but it's so much material and I just want to share all this wonderful stuff with you guys. So, all right, may all sentient beings be freed from their suffering and all the causes and conditions of their suffering. May all sentient beings be freed from, their misery and all the causes and conditions of their misery. May all sentient beings experience the great bliss which knows of no misery. May all sentient beings experience total peace and equanimity, free from all the vexations and all the problems caused by their egoistic notions, their illusions, their desires, and may all of that, may they find peace, 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 and none but peace and bliss. See you next week. Thank you guys very, very much for tuning in.